This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Welcome, everyone, to the 7th episode of the Sports and Society podcast. In this episode, we're going to discuss Chapter 6, Abuse and Violence in Sports. Why do they persist? Your hosts, once again, are Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. Good to be here with you.
Yep. Every episode is a great time. Now, this episode can be a difficult discussion for some people, since violence is oftentimes such a central part of the sports we love. Personally, I played football and rugby in high school, then I boxed for 10 years after high school. And I'm not going to lie that I love playing those sports, and I still follow boxing avidly. In fact, I'm looking forward to some good fights this very weekend. In any case, Jay, you've been writing and teaching about abuse and violence in sports for a very long time. What do you think makes it so challenging for people to talk about abuse and violence in sport?
Yeah, I think the challenge is different for different people, but for people who have participated in sports, the heavy contact sports and collision sports, and liked to watch those sports as well, you know, there is some internal moral tension there in some cases. And on the one hand, you know, the possibility of violence within a game that you're playing or watching creates a form of tension excitement that's related to the uncertainty of outcomes, and not just the final outcome of the match or the game or the event, but outcomes for the individuals who are participating. So the violence or the heavy contact and collisions draw you in a way that is different from a sport where there is a physical division between the players, like in tennis, or the lane dividers in track and field or swimming, where you're not going to have contact at all.
You know, that's such an interesting point you're raising about the division, because I've thought about this division of space and the way in which athletes can be separated in tennis in particular. Because when I was boxing at that time, there was a lot of focus on the violence in boxing and regulating boxing and those sorts of things. And in those discussions, tennis was always placed as the good sport in relationship to boxing. Now, that brings in a whole lot of issues around race and class and, to a certain extent, gender with the tennis boxing division. But as I thought about it, I was like, these sports really aren't that different in a lot of ways, because they're ultimately about, you know, control over a squared space, dominance and submission. And if I think about the metaphor of tennis, it's two clubbed warriors, or maybe four clubbed warriors, battling each other, and the way in which they express dominance is through the travel of a missile that they're whacking with the racket. However, there is that net between them that separates them. So the violence of the sport becomes purely symbolic, whereas the violence of boxing is not symbolic, because you're literally hitting that person with your hands, and they're hitting you back.
Yeah, and from a spectator's perspective, though, oftentimes in a heavy contact or collision sport, or a combat sport like boxing, you don't see the full consequences. I mean, now boxing is unique. You see it when somebody's knocked down, somebody's knocked out, that's for sure. But you don't see the consequences of that knockout that may plague that boxer for the next 6 months, and or come back to haunt them in terms of possible uh, brain injury. So those kinds of things have to be taken into account. You know, one of the challenges that people face is, how can I recognize the consequences of violence or the potential consequences uh, and still enjoy what I'm watching? And part of the reason for that is that teams and players keep those things private for a number of reasons, commercial reasons on the management side, and on the player side, from the culture of those sports, you don't want to show a weakness. So like Ronda Rousey, when she got into mixed martial arts and had a number of concussions, I think she played rugby before that, but she had a number of concussions and she would never talk about them because she never wanted to expose that weakness.
Well, absolutely. Particularly, as a fighter, I can remember being hit and hurt and stunned. So, at a certain sense, where you are, but your body doesn't cooperate. And all I could think was, how do I keep my opponent from knowing I'm hurt? Because if my opponent knows I'm hurt, that person is going to hurt me a lot worse because now I'm vulnerable.
Right. Yeah. And we don't want to be seen as vulnerable. And just for people who haven't ever been in the ring, like me, when you do get hurt in a situation in sport or even out of sport, you fall. I fell the other day, and somebody comes up and right away and says, "Are you okay?" And immediately you say, "Yeah, I'm okay." And then you walk around for the next 10 minutes wondering, what did I really hurt here? And so there's almost some shame or embarrassment involved in being hurt because it's your mistake, or you didn't cover yourself the way you should have in a sport event. So you tend to play down those things in addition to the reasons that you're talking about. So spectators and sometimes even teammates don't see the full consequences of violence in sport.
And just thinking along these lines, it reminds me of when League of Denial came out. And so many people who watched football all of a sudden, because all of the consequences of that violence, or not all of it, but so much of the consequences is kept hidden in the backstage. And what League of Denial did is it brought at least some aspects of the consequences to the front stage. And in particular, middle-class viewers suddenly felt a moral dilemma because they actually had to confront the consequences of the violence they enjoyed watching. And that's when you started to see a lot of, and in particular, again, middle-class people choosing to not watch football anymore because they felt themselves complicit with the long-term health consequences of a business, right? It's a business model predicated on long-term health consequences that the players are going to suffer. But this sort of actually kind of leads me to my next question, and it's a little bit bombastic, but you'll go with it. So when we look around the world, we just see lots of violence, whether it's wars, it could be community level violence, such as crime, economic violence, interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, and other forms of violence, right? So we live in a pretty violent world. Jay, are humans just an inherently violent species that cannot stop committing violence and therefore are magnetically drawn to watching violence?
Well, sometimes it feels like that, and it looks like that. In the case of sports, I'm thinking, where people cheer when a big hit is made. They definitely are responding in a way that pulls them in to the event in some way, shape, or form. on the field or in the ring or in the cage, and in the case of mixed martial arts. But not all violence is the same. And I think that that's one of the points that's made in the chapter is, we have brutal body contact, which occurs just as a part of certain kinds of sports. And then you have borderline violence, which is grounded in pulling out the stops for actually hurting someone else, and engaging in contact where you don't lay back, or you don't, lower the intensity in order to avoid injury. And then you have quasi-criminal violence, which definitely crosses a line, an informal line. We talked about that in one of the past podcasts, the informal norms. Quasi-criminal violence is something that there are norms against within many sports. And certainly when you come to criminal violence, there are norms against criminal violence. And so players know when those lines are crossed. And oftentimes what happens is that just leads to a revenge response where you enter the realm of quasi-criminal violence or criminal violence. And that's when people get thrown out of games. In a few cases where police have been called in hockey more than any other sport, where there may be charges filed for on-ice behavior, criminal behavior on the ice. But that's really rare. Sport is supposed to be rule governed. And so all the violence that occurs is supposed to be kind of within the rules, or there's an expectation of violence. So, you're mutually agreeing to submit to it. So it's hard to combine the whole criminal realm with the sport realm. But the players know when you've crossed the line into quasi-criminal and criminal violence, and it evokes a response in many cases. So, I'm not saying that all people just never draw a line. I think many of us draw lines. And by the way, I don't watch as much football as have in the past. And I'll watch just certain events to keep up with what's going on. But the violence in football has really gotten to me now that I really know about the long-term effects of CTE. So that's an important thing. I have a hard time, being entertained by something that I see may be harming human beings.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and we'll come back to some of the football violence in a moment. But I'm a total hypocrite, and I call myself out on this all the time when it comes to this question, because I also have grown uncomfortable with football violence. Well, football. I have studied football for 20 years. I played football. I studied it for 20 years. My attitudes toward it have really changed, and I have a much harder time watching it now than I used to. Although watching it is so wrapped up in my family, and my family's, the way in which we bond and keep our relationship strong, that it's hard for me to extricate from it completely. But I have no problem with the violence in boxing, which I am perfectly aware is equally traumatic to the body. I think it's Showtime Sean Porter. He keeps saying on his podcast, he's a former world champion, a very good welterweight boxer, and he says the human body was not meant to be beat on in the way that boxing requires, and it's just a matter of time as a result before your body's gonna break down. And there's all sorts of long-term health consequences. And, the punch-drunk boxer is a trope in books and in movies and television shows and things of that nature. Again, there's a lot of class and race elements coming in there. But it's interesting that I do see those things differently. And I don't think it's just because there is some inherent, like humans are inherently violent. We really have to understand um, why is there that class distinction? Say going back to tennis and boxing, right? The people that play tennis versus the people you don't play boxing, right? You box. It's not a sport you play. Uh, there is and we talk about this in some of the other chapters of the textbook, right? These sports do draw on different demographics. Um, and that's I think that's very important to keep in mind, that it isn't certain groups of humans in general are inherently violent, or certain groups of people are inherently violent. There is a lot of different social forces leading to that violence.
Yeah.
And we will also come back to this in a moment.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I just want to mention that violence is learned in various kinds of contexts, and this goes for participants as well as spectators. Spectators learn to accept violence in certain sport contexts and to reject it in other sport contexts. And so that's part of what we want to get across in this podcast, is that we're not talking about some inherent characteristic of certain individuals. We're talking about the context within which violence comes to be integrated into someone's life in terms of accepting the watching of it or engaging in it.
Yeah, and I want to keep pushing on this idea of context and how a desire to engage in violent sport, but also an appreciation for violent sport, is something we learn, right? It is, as we talked about in previous episodes, it is related to socialization. And so I want you to help me reflect on my own being a boxing fan, right? So boxing, like football, rugby, MMA, and other sports, broadly we call those collision sports because violent contact between athletes goes beyond coincidental, as it might be in, say, basketball, baseball, or cricket, right? Violent collision between bodies and body parts is central to the goal of those sports, right? It doesn't just happen as a part of the sport. It is the sport, right? So one of the things that happens, and you've already mentioned this, when we watch these collision sports, we see fans cheer on their heroes who will enthusiastically sacrifice their bodies for the entertainment of others who are not risking their own health. And, as a boxer, I mean, I still remember my very first match, and I hit my opponent and there was a roar in the gym. And that was incredibly powerful for I think I was 17 years old or something like that. So again, thinking about this idea of sacrifice, that the athletes are sacrificing their bodies for others. Does this mean we live in a society of ritual sacrifice?
Well, we're coming at this from different perspectives. And, you've boxed, you've been in a ring. I've never boxed, I've never been in a ring. And this is not a confession, but I have never hit anyone purposely, with a fist, for example, and I've never wanted to. However, I have engaged in acts in sport contexts on a basketball court where I've knocked somebody partially, unconscious for a couple seconds with an elbow, knocked teeth out, created a gash over somebody's eye that had needed stitches. So I've engaged in things that had violent consequences, but I have never purposely taken my fist and wanted to hurt somebody and punch them. So we're coming at it from different perspectives. And so, I haven't thought about this whole ritual aspect in the same way that you have.
And I should add that boxing in particular is highly ritualistic, and I would say several sports are very ritualistic, but boxing is the one that I participated in that is highly ritualistic, um, and that violence is so central
Yeah.
to the whole ritual.
Yeah. And sumo wrestling is another one where ritual is clear. And, in a lot of the MMA and the cage fighting, the ultimate fighting championships and so on, there's ritual there too. And I think that ritual helps the participants get involved in the action. It prepares them for the action, and it legitimizes the action as well. But when we talk about a ritual sacrifice, I'm going to go along with the historians and the anthropologists here and say that a ritual sacrifice really is connected with the realm of the sacred or the supernatural in some way, where you're appeasing some force that transcends the ring, so to speak. And uh, I think that that's pretty rare. I mean, maybe there's something of that in sumo wrestling. I don't know enough about some of the way people connect the supernatural realm with sumo, but there may be in some cases this notion of ritualistic sacrifice. But for the most part, boxing is secular. It's modern. Somebody may bless themselves, a Catholic, before they go out there and box. They may say a little prayer before they enter the ring. But, the supernatural is not involved. I don't hear a lot of boxers saying they're doing it to appease God. So they might be appeasing their fathers, they might be appeasing their peers, but it's secular rather than sacred. So I make a separation between the notion of ritual sacrifice and just putting your body on the line for the sake of the outcome, for the sake of the culture of the sport, and in some cases for the sake of entertaining spectators.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but I want to push this idea of violence within a modern civilization a little farther, because this is what we're talking about, I think, is what are the ways in which in a modern secular society we legitimize these forms of violence. So there's a group of British sociologists guided by what's called figuration theory, and they argue that modern societies create an extensive civil society where acts of expressive violence are suppressed and routed into symbolic forms. So spectator sports creates a realm in contemporary societies where people can exercise their desires for expressive violence in controlled environments. So you can scream for your favorite team and you can cheer on big hits, but of course you yourself don't have to take those big hits. There's a special group of people who, and I'm going to go back to, sacrifice their bodies for the pleasure of others. And so the figuration theorists, right, they call this a quest for excitement. How does this quest for excitement, Jay, help us to understand the appeal of collision sports?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it creates this tension excitement that I'm talking about in terms of what's going to happen, so there's this uncertainty element that is created. But I want to add one of the figurationalists' concepts here to our discussion, and that is the civilization process, and the fact that sports was part of the civilization process because it took this expressive, the instrumental violence that existed in warfare and so on, and it turned it into rule-governed violence. And I think that term is really important to remember. The violence in sport is 95% rule-governed. And that that creates a very different context for the participants. They know the rules, they know other people know the rules, and so they know that there is some lines being drawn in what's going to happen on the field. And they have referees to enforce those lines. So that's an important thing to remember, that that we're talking about voluntary involvement in a rule-governed context in which combat occurs. In the case of boxing, wrestling, cage fighting, ultimate fighting, and so on, and also for football and other sports that aren't even considered contact sports, like basketball and soccer. So rugby certainly would be, but it's all rule governed, and that provides an enforcement approach to what's going on the field, so to speak, and it leads athletes to set some kinds of limits in certain cases. And those limits are enforced by referees. So, if you hit somebody below the belt in boxing, that's a problem. I mean, that you're going to be sanctioned for that. So, there's rules even in those sports.
Well, and I think one of the things that's important with this idea of quest for excitement, why is it that we in a contemporary society have this quest for excitement? And or maybe maybe you'd like to talk about that. I mean, instead of me answering my own question,
well, I'd like to.
I was about to answer my own question. I'll let you go ahead and talk about this, the quest for excitement within the civilizing process.
Yeah, because during the civilizing process, things become regulated. They become rule constrained, and so that people are living with limits. And I think that sometimes, well, we know this, pushing limits can be exciting and it can be entertaining to watch. So how can sport is interesting in that sense, because they're pushing some of these limits that exist off the field. And that's exciting for the spectators. And it's also exciting for the athletes, because they're engaging in behaviors that they wouldn't feel permitted to engage in outside of sport. So basically, you've got this sport separated as a sphere within which this special kind of behavior can occur, and that's tension exciting. You're pushing limits, and people are interested to explore the limits that they're not exploring in their everyday lives. So there's, it's a discovery process in a way. What are the limits? What happens when you go beyond them? And some people have actually used sport, or not used it, but said that it helps control violence in the rest of society, because people start to understand that the violence in sport is rule governed. There are limits, that limits need to be set in any context. And that turns us all into rule followers relating to violence. Now that is something that's been questioned in research, and we can talk about carryover here. Do the things that are learned in sport, when do they carry over into non-sport settings, and when don't they carry over? And a lot of it depends upon the culture of that sport and how the coaches and the referees and others accentuate the boundaries between that sport and the rest of life. So when those boundaries get erased or muted in some way, then there's possibilities for carryover. And that's where some of the problems arise with violence off the field that athletes would engage in, the ones that you mentioned at the start of the podcast. So, and that's where the problems come in. That's where leagues become involved, teams become involved, and that creates a major public relations problems for sport. Uh, and it affects the commercial value of sport, and it affects the careers of athletes.
There's kind of a contradiction that you're pointing to in the way in which we talk about sport. And I think, again, it's tied to the great sports myth. So we say that sports teaches a lot of pro-social behaviors, whether it's a work ethic, teamwork, so on and so forth. But the violence of sport, we keep it on the field. Well, one of the things, because most of the sports that we engage in now, or the most popular sports, are based around competition. So they're based around dominance and submission. And so one of the things that you're learning is dominance, is competition to try to conquer another group of people, right? And win in these events. To what degree do we then take those lessons and apply them outside of sport? If the use of violence, of instrumental violence, is central, and not just to collision sports, as you talked about, your own experience, like basketball is supposed to be a non-contact sport, but obviously contact in basketball, soccer, lots of sports, it's central to the sport itself. That violence becomes central to winning in those sports. So then do you take those lessons on dominance, on the instrumental use of violence? And I want to add, not just violence towards other people, violence towards yourself. Because ultimately, what's your greatest limit in sport? Your own body. So part of the training is training us to push our bodies farther, to torture our bodies even more, and withstand it, right? As cyclists say, learning to suffer, right? In every sport, we have to learn to suffer, right? Do we take those lessons in self-directed violence with us when we leave sport, right? And so this idea that sport is somehow lessening violence in society, right? The research has certainly questioned that assumption.
Yeah, and so the big question is, what are the conditions under which people take the learning that they've experienced in sport related to physical contact, related to violence, combat, and use them outside of sport? And I think that there are things that can happen in sport to help athletes create that boundary, and make it a sacred boundary almost, where once I'm out of the ring, then yeah, I know I can defend myself, but that's the only thing I would do. I wouldn't initiate, and because my fists are dangerous, and my goal is not to hurt anybody outside of the ring. So, but the other problem there, when we talk about carryover, is that if someone is known for their ability to do violence in a sport, they're oftentimes challenged in non-sport settings. Somebody looking to up their status in the bar or on the street or wherever. And they know that this athlete is known for violence, and if they get in a fight with him or they challenge him and the athlete backs down, that's a feather in their status cap. So what happens is that athletes will get challenged. Some athletes will get challenged off the field or out of the ring by people more than other people will. And so then that involves them in potentially violent situations off the field. And that's a special kind of a set of circumstances, because in some cases, that athlete is actually protecting themselves from somebody who wants to get them to submit. But in other cases, are athletes more likely to fly off the handle, so to speak, with a violent response when they're challenged by trash talk, in a non-sports setting? Well, we haven't looked at that specific example in research, but in sport, very frequently, athletes learn to control themselves in the face of trash talk. And I remember when I first faced trash talk in Chicago in street basketball, and I didn't know how, as a white kid, growing up, apart from playing the dozens and the other kinds of narrative traditions that exist within certain minority cultures within the United States in particular, with Black Americans. I wasn't accustomed to that, and I really had to work hard at accepting trash talk as just part of the whole presentation of self within this competitive realm that is used as a strategy. And it wasn't personal, and for the most part. So I got used to it, but I seldom did it, and I still personally have a problem with certain kinds of dominance gestures, the symbolic dominance gestures on the field of play, where you're expressing your dominance over another person, you're expressing your masculinity, your power. That I never got into that, but I understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to go back before we move on. I wanted to go back to this idea of the quest for excitement, and my favorite example of this that some of the people listening to the podcast are probably familiar with is Fight Club. And if you think about the Edward Norton character, so this guy he works in insurance. I think he's an adjuster. He goes out he sees these horrific accidents, and his job is to try to minimize the liability of the insurance company. And this is even in the trailer. There's a scene where he's looking through an IKEA catalog, flipping through the pages of an IKEA catalog, and saying to himself, "What kind of man do I want to buy?" Right? Because this is the right. So he's in so many ways he's the epitome of privilege in late 20th century United States. He's young, he's white, he's male, he's athletic, he's college educated. He has a professional class job, right? Working white collar job, and yet he's absolutely dissatisfied with his life because he's so profoundly bored that the way in which he identifies his masculinity as associated with risk-taking, struggle, overcoming hardship, enduring pain, all of these things have been removed from his life. So while he has this idealized identity, the identity is very dissatisfying to him. And that's what draws him into, right, with the Brad Pitt character, who, spoiler alert, right, they're the same person. I mean, that's clear in the movie. Draws him into this fight club, right? And he creates this world where risk can be returned to a very civilized life, and it allows these men to perform what they consider an idealized masculinity. And I think this really captures this idea of the quest for excitement, that a modern society, a modern civilization transforms our relationships to each other, our relationships to our bodies, and takes away modes of expression that people in some situations would want to engage in. And so we then create these rituals that allow us to express those emotional desires that we might have.
And by the way, it's combined with skills. That's the other. I think that's an important factor to pull in here, because, I will watch plays in a football game, and I appreciate the skills, and the longer I watch, it's because I'm pulled into the game by the skills that are being exhibited by the players, uh, and and I can even understand that with boxing, although I don't know boxing like you do. But if you watch a boxing match, I'm sure that you are identifying the expression and manifestation of skills to a much greater extent than I am. And so that gives you cover in a sense. It gives you moral cover for watching boxing because you're focused on the skills, not on the violence. And I think that's what happens with a lot of people. And that's tied to this tension, excitement, and the rule, and what the figurationalists say about rule governed violence in sport. You know that there's limits. You know that the focus is skills, and so that the violence itself is there, but it's not the only thing that is creating tension, excitement, and it's not your sole focus in terms of being a spectator either. So, and the fact that the athletes cover it up, the consequences, and the teams cover it up, you have this moral out within this civilizing process related to how sports are played. So the tension, excitement can exist with violence, combat, collision, without challenging the morality of the players or the spectators. So now that line sometimes gets challenged when they bring the ambulance on the football field for the player from the the Buffalo team, who was close to death on the field, and that shocked 70,000 people in those stands, saying, "Oh my God, am I taking pleasure watching someone die in front of me?" And that raised a lot of questions for a lot of people, even the TV spectators as well as the on-site spectators, and it created problems for the announcers as well, because all this praising of the warrior approach to football was now coming back to slap them in the face. Oh my gosh, somebody may be dying in front of us. How do I create a narrative that will allow me to keep my job and keep football entertaining for people? And that was tough. And it lasted for a few months, for most of the season. In fact, it even lasted till the next season when that player showed up for practice. So, and it affected the players as well in a similar way. So yeah, there is that paradox that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, and it also emphasizes the boundaries that we create as we watch combat sports, contact collision sports.
I'm glad you said the word paradox there, because we've used that term several times in the series, and for people listening, sociologists love paradox because it brings out these contradictions and complexity to the world that we live in, and that's what we're trying to explore in our research and our teaching, is looking at things in multiple dimensions, and not just the great sports myth wants you to view sport in a singular dimension. Sport is good, and that shouldn't be questioned. We question that so that we can see all of these different dimensions. So this actually brings me to the next question that I want to raise, and this gets us back to where we were a few moments ago before I went into I went back to the quest for excitement. But something that we've talked about repeatedly is that sports, right, is a socializing institution, and it's largely led, to a large extent, it's directed by adults, particularly organized, what we tend to call organized sport. So I'm thinking very specifically about my own experience of doing the Oklahoma drill when playing high school football. Now, anyone that's played football, maybe not anyone, but most people who have played football have experienced one version or another of this thing that gets called the Oklahoma drill. It goes by some other names as well. But when I played it, I mean, when I did it, I can still remember the very first time I did it. What we did was we broke up the team into two groups, and we all laid on the ground with our heads pointing at each other, and we were probably 10 to 15 yards apart from each other. So you laid on your back with your head facing your opponent. And I can still remember, right? This was, summer, looking up at the blue California sky. I could hear like cars driving by nearby, birds chirping in the trees. But I'm waiting for the coach to blow his whistle, because when the coach blows his whistle, you stand up, you have to spin around so you're slightly disoriented, you spot your opponent, and then you charge at each other and collide as hard as you possibly can, right? And so and you're cheered on by the coaches while you do this. And of course, there's a lot of variation on this. So one of the things that people will say is that when adults intentionally create drills like the Oklahoma drill that both organizes and intensifies interpersonal violence between children, because these are, could be like Pop Warner players doing this. I was in high school. That it's a form of child abuse. Would you say that this is a type of abuse as we defined it in the chapter?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to answer it, I'm going to go back to just one quick thing that we talked about last week when we talked about deviance in sport. People in sport learn the norms of the sport ethic, and in other words, dedicating yourself to the game, striving for distinction, playing through pain and injury, and overcoming barriers, and those are all positive norms in a way, and that's part of the learning experience. Well, what you're talking about, and any of our listeners can go and just do a search on the Oklahoma drill, and you will see a number of variations of it, and they're really interesting. Oftentimes, the players get around in a circle, and they watch their teammates collide with each other. And this is all part of the socializing experience, where coaches are trying to get the players to accept violent behavior, to accept the extremes of violent contact and collisions that they're going to experience in football without being fearful of them, and trying to manage that contact in ways that protect themselves from more serious injuries, and enabling them to strive to dominate an opponent in a way that they don't have experience with in the rest of their lives. So the coach wants to eliminate some of those lines, those moral lines that you've drawn in your life apart from sport, so that they can toughen you up and create an athlete. And that's not just the physical contact part of it. That's the normative support for that physical contact. And it's tied to the skills that you engage in to avoid injury yourself while you're doing violence. So it's a complicated thing. And the Oklahoma drill is set up to teach all of those things. So, and by the time you get to the Oklahoma drill in your football life, you've already accepted the norms of the sport ethic. And so you're part of the way there already. And so now we just have to get you to voluntarily create physical contact in ways that are violent. We've got to help you develop your ability to do violence in a football way.
That's such a great point. And when I think about it, because usually the way the Oklahoma drill is set up, you're not learning to block and you're not really learning to tackle, right? you're actually not learning specific skills that you formally need to play the game. But in my mind, what you're really learning, especially when you're a young person early doing this, is you are learning to overcome your natural aversion towards pain and injury. That you come to view pain and injury as something really positive, especially when you've got adults cheering you on, and your peers cheering you on. You now associate pain and injury, both the pain and injury you can deliver, but also the pain and injury you can withstand, as honorable, as filled with prestige, as something to actually desire. And then that's a lesson that you then take into the sport and outside of sport realms as well.
Yeah, and I'll add the moral dimension to that too. Growing up as a Catholic kid playing some organized football in my youth, I learned do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so this whole notion of knocking somebody flat was related to the moral principle, a violation of the moral principles that I was learning. And I think that creates an issue for some religious football players, boxers, rugby players. How do they turn this action that they're engaged in on the field, in the ring, into an action that's not immoral, but in fact is moral? I mean, it's part of living up to the expectations to your teammates, to the coach, to the whole notion of the sport and what it means and so on. So, yeah, so it's an involved issue when you get out there and have to engage in something that can really hurt somebody in a serious way.
I want to move us on a little bit, but I want to come back to the issue of abuse, because we actually haven't addressed abuse yet. But so give me two questions, and we'll get back to the discussion of abuse. So far we've been talking about sports that are predominantly male: football, boxing, rugby. And of course, women participate in these sports, but they're predominantly male sports. So what do you think this tells us about a society where successfully performing violence in sports is often seen as proving one's masculinity, but not one's femininity?
Yeah, it goes back to the emergence of the definition of masculinity in various societies. And in most societies, masculinity is tied to being a protector. And that's how, in other words, if you're violent, you're doing it to protect. You're doing it to protect yourself in self-defense. You're doing it to protect your family, and you're doing it to protect your country. And so, at all of these different levels, we needed people to be protectors, and that got baked in, so to speak, an approach towards masculinity. And femininity was complicit in this, because females learned to nurture and support those who are the protectors in society. So this was not something just limited to men. Women accepted the violence as being necessary as a form of protection, as well as men. So anyway, that it gets built into gender and gender expression in interesting ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So now next question I want to ask you, and this gets us back to the issue of abuse. And I want to focus specifically on sexual violence in sports. And when we talk about violence in sports, yeah, we're going to typically think about football, hockey, rugby, the violence that happens on the field that's like built in, or maybe the rule breaking where people go beyond the rules and they engage in violence that they're not supposed to. And think about when I played rugby, in the scrum, punching somebody, grabbing their testicles and squeezing them very hard, right? Things like that. And we already addressed that. Jay, can you talk about some of the structural conditions that increase the probability of sexual violence occurring in sporting spaces?
Uh, yeah, I think it's the fact that there is a hierarchy connected with sport. That's one of the main issues here. And there is also the notion of domination that exists within sport and any competitive activity. There is some kind of a form of using power or skill to overcome or to dominate an opponent. So, so those things get built into the culture of sport on the one hand, uh, and and the hierarchy that exists in sport gives coaches permission to engage in behaviors that that the athletes on their teams would see as abusive, and the coach justifies that by saying, wait a minute, I'm trying to create the challenging circumstances that exist in a competitive event and get my athletes to handle them in a way where uh, they don't get fearful. So I am going to use certain forms of abuse uh, to 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 toughen the athletes up, to prepare them for the difficult environment that they're going to experience within a competitive contest. Now, the sexual abuse is really tied to that hierarchy, uh, the coach athlete hierarchy in particular, and the fact that male coaches and athletes, the hierarchy there opens the door for an athlete, for a coach to first of all put his hands on an athlete, and secondly to have that not be defined as deviant, and that then can escalate to a point where all of a sudden, it becomes kind of a cross between intimacy and teaching, and if you have a male coach and a female athlete, that can have an effect on how they view each other, and it opens up the door for possible sexual abuse. And I don't feel comfortable making generalizations about whether that's going to happen under certain conditions or not, but it certainly happens enough that it's a major problem in sports, both women's and men's sports, by the way. And the whole notion of what the medical personnel at USA Gymnastics were engaging in. Larry Nasser, the doctor for the USA Gymnastics, was engaging in with these young female gymnasts. And once that particular issue became exposed, and those female gymnasts articulated what was going on with them and their relationship with this doctor, that their voices were heard all over the world. And what happened was that opened up the door for women in particular, but not only women, to talk about the abuse that they were experiencing in their relationship with coaches in particular, and how that abuse was affecting their lives. So there was an explosion of research between 2016 and today that I have not gotten through altogether, but I've read literally a couple hundreds of articles and reports on that kind of abuse. And it is much more popular or prevalent, not popular, prevalent than I ever imagined. And I was coming at it from a male perspective where, oh, the coach yelled at me. That's what coaches are supposed to do, And then when I walked off the field, it wasn't a big deal. But there are ways to emotionally and psychologically and even physically abuse players that really has an impact on them. And it will vary from one player to another, but the lines are becoming much more clear now that we've had all this research on the various kinds of abuse that exist in sport, especially coach-athlete relationships. And that's why safe sport is now a global phenomenon, hoping that athletes will report when lines have been crossed. And that's why coaches are being educated to know when they're attacking an individual on a personal level rather than on a teaching level. And, there's two ways to correct people, a constructive way and a way that can be embarrassing and shaming and emotionally devastating. And coaches have to learn the differences between those.
I mean, it's amazing what we allow from coaches, and actually sometimes revere in coaches. If one human did that to another human in almost any other context, it would be absolutely unacceptable. But when a coach berates an adult, berates a child, somehow that's seen in many places as a positive. In fact, one of my coworkers, he coached youth basketball, and he didn't want to yell at the kids. And what he found is yelling at the kids was actually really counterproductive. But if they didn't win a game, many of the parents would tell him, you need to yell at those kids more, that you're not being strict enough, that somehow that yelling is equated with strictness, and that's equated with discipline, and that's good. So there are all of these structural factors, the public-private nature of sport relationships between coaches, the shared passion to achieve goals, right? There's all these structural conditions that increase probabilities of abusive behaviors, which is not to say that sport in a one-to-one way causes abuse. That is not the argument we're making at all, but it is these structural conditions that could increase the probability that these things might happen. So Jay, I want to squeeze in one more question, because we're always running a little bit long. So I want to squeeze in one more question. And this is about spectator violence. And we tend to assume that when spectators at sporting events engage in violence, it's spontaneous and it's disorganized emotional reactions. Can you also talk about some of the larger structural forces that pattern spectator violence?
Yeah, the violence among spectators is oftentimes connected with violence on the field, and so you'll probably see more violence among spectators in situations where spectators perceive the actions on the field to be violent. And so that's one of the structural things that are structural forces that affect what goes on in the stands. The other thing is that oftentimes violence among spectators gets initiated by accident. And I think the most destructive forms of spectator violence are related to panics and riots, and where there is a breakdown in social control, and all of a sudden you have a movement of people that is tied to the emotions of everybody in the crowd, and there's this emotional contagion that occurs where people start moving without thinking about the consequences, and somebody falls and people get trampled, people get hit and pushed aside, and this is all an emotional response that is tied to a breakdown initially in social control. And it's oftentimes tied to a special event that occurs on the field. So, uh, so we need to understand that more in order to prevent the most serious consequences of spectator violence, and learn when it occurs, how it's tied to the subculture of fans, how it's tied to other parts of the fan experience. And and I think that that's something that a lot of the people who were in charge of social control of sport events didn't understand, a half century ago. And the researchers in England who studied soccer hooliganism and looked at the conditions under which it occurred and how it might be controlled. That was the first time that research was really done on violent spectators as a phenomenon. So it's important that people who run sport teams, who run venues, are familiar with some of that research, so that they can eliminate the conditions under which violence among spectators is most likely.
When I think about this, one of the things I always reflect on is the way in which sports makes non-normative behavior normative. So we talked about this in the previous episode on deviance, and I talked about how, as a young man, what the outcome of a sporting event, like hugging and crying, other, a straight young man hugging and crying, with other straight young men and so forth. And so that the sport gave license to non-normative behavior. And that's something that British research, right, points to, is that creates traditions. That there are certain kinds of non-normative behavior that is normative in the sporting space, and oftentimes it could be fan violence. And then when the authorities, because it's a liability to have people engaging in violence, and in particular, it turns off middle-class ticket buyers who are more active consumers from going to those events. So they really have an interest in it. They then start pushing the violence out of the stadium. I love to show this. There's lots of these clips on YouTube you can look up, but there's one clip in particular I tend to show my students of it. I think it's in the Ukraine, and it's two firms or two groups of football hooligans who meet in a field. It appears to be somewhere in the vicinity of the stadium, but is clearly not next to the stadium. And you can see there's trees around this field. So from a distance, people can't see what's going on in this space. On one side, there's a group of young men. It's all men. They're wearing red shirts. And on the other side is a group of young men who aren't wearing shirts. And they march towards each other in formation, chanting. And then within, I would say, 5 yards of each other, they charge. And it's a huge melee. And one team beats down the other. I say team, right? Because it looks like a team sport. One group beats down the other. And there's a way in which they are, in fact, recreating a sporting event outside of the stadium because they're not good enough athletes, right? They're not skilled enough. I shouldn't say good enough. I don't want to give it moral terms, right? They're not skilled enough athletes to be on the pitch, but they're recreating their own event outside. And it's really fascinating how all of these different conditions will lead to, and it's not just within sport, right? These tend to be working class men who are working out larger economic frustrations and whatnot, right? All these things come together to produce this particular incident, and one that repeats over and over and across large parts of the world.
And I think it's harder for some of the people in the United States to understand what goes on in some other parts of the world, because we've had different kinds of spectator traditions. We haven't had, partly because of the distance between teams in the U.S. where you don't get large crowds of people from opposing teams in the same stadium, where the conditions for a fair fight, so to speak, exist. And so, and you don't have that coming together of large groups of opposing fans that you do in the smaller spaces in England, for example, where it's, a train ride away to the next stadium. And you have people drinking on the way, and you have a history of a rivalry between two groups of people. And the stadium, in many cases, initially didn't have things to separate those fans. Now, in some cases, there's chain link fence with barbed wire on the top to separate fans from the different teams. But there was a tradition of outdoing the fans of the other team with your in-stadium antics. And those antics sometimes got violent. So, if you want to do a search on this, just search ultras, football ultras, and you will see the lighting of fireworks in the stands, the starting of fires, and the chanting that goes along with it that reaffirms the identity of a particular group and its differences between their identity and the identities of other groups. And that just sets the stage for a possible confrontation after the game. So, and we don't have that in the same way for the most part in the United States. So, where there is that history, that tradition, and the kinds of things that kind of gear the fans up emotionally, the male fans in particular, for a battle. And when I watch some of the videos of the ultras, this would be arrestable offenses in any U.S. stadium. And, shooting M80s right at your opponents or out onto the field. And those are things that I define as crazy. I've seen somebody throw a beer bottle or a beer can, something like that, onto the field, maybe a ball from the stands of a baseball game. But I've never seen somebody shoot, a rocket towards a player on the field, which has happened in European soccer games. So there's some different traditions.
To wrap us up, Jay, I don't want to let people in the United States totally off the hook. And I'm thinking about it was a scene, an old episode of The Simpsons, and I can't remember exactly, but someone's listening to the radio and they say, the Washington, D.C. team has just won the Super Bowl. They'll be lighting fires and turning over cars in the nation's capital tonight. So we do have our tradition of spectator violence, for sure. It is certainly different than what we see in Europe and Latin America, for sure.
Yeah, and it still happens occasionally. It happened a lot post-war in the 50s and the 60s, especially around issues related to race and poverty and some other things that led to gang fights. The gangs would use the venue as a place to gather and to confront their enemies in the neighborhood or the community.
Well, I'll tell you from my own just anecdotal, non-systematic research, having gone to a lot of professional boxing matches, one of the things I noticed is the only times I have seen fighting taking place in the stands at a professional boxing match is when at least one of the fighters in the headline event is white. And literally every time I have seen fights break out in the stands, which again is different from the kind of hooliganism we talk about in Europe and Latin America. But again, it's tensions around race come to the fore. People want to participate. Their emotions come out, and all of the things we've talked about here. Well, we better wrap it up. This might be our longest episode yet. So thanks so much as always, Jay.
And I just want to say one quick thing before we end. We haven't talked about terrorism, which is planned political violence at sport events. And when you watch the 26 World Cup in Mexico, Canada, and the United States, and when you watch the Olympics in Paris coming up, the amount of security and security expenses now are massive in anticipation of possible terrorism. And that's something that maybe we can talk about at a later time, but it's an issue that you're probably going to see and hear about as you watch some of these mega global sport events in the near future.
I think we need to do an episode just on security in stadiums at mega sporting events, and that'll be for a different season. But in our next episode, we're going to discuss Chapter 7, Sex, Gender, and Sports. Are inclusion and equality possible? Thank you so much, Jay.
Okay, Jeff. Hey, see you next week.